inviting me and making me welcome. We acknowledge Aboriginal people, or we're changing our language around this now. We've had too many people tell us that they don't like being referred to as Aboriginal or Indigenous, so we are now using First Peoples as a nomenclature for that because we think it's more accurate and respectful. So I will try and stick to that. I've called this From Brexit to Bellingen because I want to start with the election night. I had a discussion with a friend of mine, Tony, who is actually a local resident of Nambucca. He lives at Valor Beach. He's an anthropologist, but he spends a lot of time in the UK as well. And I was talking about my dismay at the Labor Party's position in the UK on Brexit, that they were against or sitting on the fence with Brexit. I see the European Union as a baby boomer and son of migrants who came from England and Poland. The EU to me represents a unifying institution that has helped have peace in Europe for the last 60 or 70 years, and it's a kind of tenet of faith that that's a good thing, that you have these unifying institutions. He pointed out to me that in the north of England in particular, amongst working people in England, the European Union hadn't done much for those people, that there weren't many jobs, their wages hadn't risen, there weren't enterprises that had been developed as a result of the European Union. So he understood why they were not necessarily in favour of the European Union and why Corbyn sat on the fence, as it were, around Brexit and didn't really come out one way or the other. So it just led me to thinking about the tension between unifying institutions and local activity. And that led me to think about Quexit. You've seen the memes following the election that we should be dragging Queensland off into the ocean, into the Pacific somewhere, as a response to the election result. And I just have to say, I've been in Queensland for 15 years now, and the one thing I do know about Queensland politics, and it's hard to know much about Queensland politics, but the one thing I do know is that it's volatile. 2 elections ago at a state level we had an overwhelming majority of LNP government. There was only 6 members of the Labor Party left. The joke was that you could have a cabinet meeting in a Volkswagen. And yet 3 years after that, at the end of one single term, Queensland elected a Labor government. So it's a volatile place and it's a sensitive electorate in terms of the issues that affect it. So I think, when I think about the election, and I think in terms of jobs and the issues that people were sensitive to, I can understand the vote, at least theoretically, even though I'll never quite understand it viscerally. I'm still coming to terms with the result of the election, and I'll come to that why. So one of the issues, I think, was coal mines and saving the planet. So the election had a big polar effect. We had increased votes in cities for the Labor Party and big swings to the LNP, and because I'm from Queensland I refer to them as the LNP as one thing. Big swings to the LNP in regional areas, but also out of suburban areas, and I think that's really about people's fear of jobs and security and those sorts of issues. And coal in central Queensland represents jobs. And even though anybody who's studied coal in Queensland knows that most of that coal is actually used for coking coal in the manufacture of steel and isn't for energy production, etc. Nonetheless, for the people who work in those industries, it represented something that they were sensitive to in terms of their fears. And we have to understand people's fears as much as their aspirations and those sorts of things when we analyse these things. So I think that kind of understands the regions. But there are also some scares and hares, as I've called them, around the election campaign. And the ones that related to housing were a campaign in particular that was run by the Real Estate Institute of Australia and the Property Council against the negative gearing and capital gains tax proposals that were there from Labor which were proposals we had been advocating for the last 20 years, and which we were pleased to see there, and which I still think were not the reason for the result last Saturday from the Labor Party's perspective. From my perspective, the Labor Party got a bounce when it announced that bold policy of having a good look at negative gearing and capital gains tax. That's when Bill Shorten's campaign really took off 2 years ago when that was announced. But I think when you then overlay that with the franking credits issue and a number of other issues, what happened then to the Labor Party was that they had too many messages for too many different parts of the constituency, and it opened up the ability to run a fear campaign against those particular measures. Now, the REIA and the Property Council's campaign was based on a whole range of myths. One was that your house price would go down. There's no evidence to suggest that would have been done. Even the Treasury said, look, if you brought these changes in, there might be a very modest impact on house prices, but it wouldn't be much. They argued that your rents would go up. There is no evidence to suggest that rents would have gone up. The only time we've had a change to those policies was when Paul Keating adjusted negative gearing back in the 80s. Rents went up in Sydney and in Perth, but for completely different reasons, because they didn't go up in any other capital city. And if it was a result of the policy, you expect that to be a uniform change across the board, not a bit of a change here but no change elsewhere. So that was another myth. All of the modelling that's been done around that shows that there wouldn't really have been an increase in rents, and the logic of it tells you that. What we've had over the last, since 1999, however long ago that is, it seems like a long time ago now, since 1999 when the capital gains tax was changed so that the discount, instead of being an adjustment for inflation, became a flat 50% discount for investors. That's what drove investors into the Australian property market. Negative gearing helped them along the way to offset their costs, etc. But it was really the chase for the capital gain in the shortest possible time that drove investors into the market. So it's only logical that if investors were going to leave the market as a result of those changes, that they would be selling houses. But who would they be selling those houses to? Not other investors, because they weren't in the market. They would have been selling them to homeowners, to people who were going to occupy it for themselves. Where are those homeowners now? They're in the rental market. Right? So they would have been moving out of the rental market into home ownership, so the pressure in the rental market actually would have been downwards, not upwards. So all of these things are logically explainable, but they are difficult, and it's much easier to fight a scare campaign than it is to fight a complex argument. Again, this is about the tension between unifying institutions like tax systems and local effects, where people are susceptible to fear far more than they are to logic. And that's the point that I really want to make. We saw big swings between city and rural and regional electorates, and that was really interesting because it showed that even in blue ribbon Liberal electorates through the cities of Australia, there was a swing to Labor, where there were higher paid, higher educated populations. Where there were lower educated, lower paid populations, we got a swing the other way. Now, I don't want to speculate too much about that, but I think it's really about the susceptibility to fear. And Labor seem to have forgotten the lesson that Paul Keating taught them in 1993, that it's very easy to run a fear campaign against a tax package. John Hewson lost that election in 1993 because Paul Keating was better at campaigning about fear on tax. So the GS2 became a big scare campaign, and Paul Keating won that election, the sweetest victory of all, as he called it at the time. Not a miracle, but an election based on fear again. So the Labor Party forgot its own lessons, and it went for a complex message. Personally, I support that. I would much rather have a party putting forward the things that it believes in than just saying, you know, I'm a good bloke and you can't trust him. And really that's all that the government did through the campaign. So I've now clearly declared my own politics. But the big tragedy is that we've lost an agenda. And that was really an agenda for a national housing strategy which the Labor Party had embedded in their platform. Right? How many people in the room knew that had Labor been elected that they were going to build 250,000 new affordable homes? Okay, that's pretty good, about half. But not many people really, I think, understood that that policy would have meant we had 250,000 new homes. It was an $8 billion investment over 10 years. The biggest single investment in affordable housing the country's probably ever would have seen. But more importantly than that, and I know this because I've had these conversations, we were going to shift the housing portfolio out of the Department of Social Services where it currently sits into an infrastructure department under Anthony Albanese as Minister for Infrastructure. That was going to happen under Labor, and we were going to change the conversation about housing from one of a welfare approach to one of an infrastructure approach. And when councils are looking at this, Daniel and Mayor, you need to think about housing as an investment in infrastructure that supports people's participation socially, culturally and economically. And that's really what housing represents. It's an infrastructure investment. It's not a residual welfare investment, which is the approach that Australia's had to these issues for the last 30 years. So I just wanted to start with that, and now I want to move on to what's been happening with housing. So we've had, as Kerry was saying earlier, a drop in home ownership. This is Grattan Institute analysis from the last census. In every single age group, we've had a drop in home ownership except for 65 plus, which is retained about the same. But if you look at 25 to 35 to 34-year-olds and 35 to 44-year-olds, we've had a massive drop in home ownership rates. So young people just aren't getting into the market. They're stuck in the rental market. The need for social and affordable housing grows. So we're in the crisis of a shortage of affordable and social housing. Ahuri estimates that now we will need 727,300 additional social housing dwellings over the next 20 years. That's a huge number. Even Labor's program of 250,000 would have only been a third of that, even if it was social housing and it was a broader package than social housing. The census shows that our level of social housing was 7% in 1991, and it's now down to 4.2% in the last census, and it's probably dropped since then. So we have lost a lot of social housing. Partly that's to do with population growth, but mainly it's to do with a lack of investment by the federal and state government in social housing. The University of New South Wales recently, with Chair New South Wales, I'd add, estimated that the need for social and affordable housing over that same period by 2036 will be 1 million. 1 million new houses over the next 18 to 20 years are what is going to be required. That's a massive growth. Now, why is it? If you look at this, this is public sector housing completions 1950 to 2018. That's a pretty big tranche of time, but you can see that it has just been dropping and dropping and dropping. You know, that line is going down and down and down. The little boost there, the very welcome boost there, that was the nation building stimulus program of the Rudd and Gillard governments, which added 20,000 properties in one hit over 2 years. It wasn't really done as a boost to social housing, it was done as an economic stimulus. Nonetheless, it was very welcome. But we need one of those every couple of years. This is another way of looking at public sector housing completions, and the point of this one is to show that the only growth we've had, and partly to do with that stimulus which largely went to the community housing sector rather than to public housing departments, was in community housing. Community housing is the one bright note that we have in terms of the growth of social and affordable housing in Australia, and I'll come back to that theme. The national tragedy of homelessness, it just keeps growing and growing. I'll need to correct my bio. I've actually been involved for 40 years now. I started as a youth worker at a youth refuge in Hobart some 40 years ago. Homelessness was a tiny problem then relative to now. I've been involved in this for 40 years, and you'd have to say my track record of advocacy at fixing this problem hasn't been very good. I cannot retire without having some success in this area. We need to turn this picture around. We now have 116,000 people on any given night. That will be a vast underestimate of the total homeless population. We have a growth in rough sleeping. All of you know this data very well, but I just want to point it out. So we've now got per 10,000 people, 3.5 people who are homeless on any given night, and 8,200 people rough sleeping. And that number has just gone up this morning. There's been new data from Huri showing that that number is way up, and it's now concentrating in our urban centres. This is our rental affordability index map of your local area. The colour coding really is that the closer to red it becomes, the worse it is. Green is affordable housing. Yellow is really on the margins of moderately unaffordable housing. So even at average national household earnings of $80,000 a year, this area is not affordable in terms of its rental market. At $80,000 a year now, I'm betting that regionally the average annual income per household is much lower than that. So if we look at what it looks like at 60,000 a year, which is probably closer to the mark, it's really unaffordable and severely unaffordable in large part as well. If we look then at what it looks like for a pensioner couple, it's even worse. And all of the grey areas on that chart really represent where there's no two-bedroom properties. So they can't live in those areas. They can only live in areas where there are two-bedroom properties. And what our index does is maps the cost of rents in the area against the incomes of people in that area or as a state average. So this is what we're looking at, but we can adjust it for all sorts of things. If you want to have a look at it for yourself, you can go to the SGS website and look at their third space, and there's an interactive map of the rental affordability index that allows you to play with it, go back and forth over time, zoom in on particular areas, change the household profiles. It's really actually a very good tool. Anybody doing submissions, use the tool, because that's what it's there for. But if you think it's bad here, I just thought this was a useful contrast. This is what it looks like in Sydney. So there's nothing in Sydney that's affordable, even at average incomes, really, until you get way out to where you really don't want to commute from. You know, Sydney is really a basket case in terms of rental affordability. And if you want to look at it, what it looks like in Sydney for a pensioner couple, and that's $50,000 a year. It's not an incredibly low income, but it's a modest income. Our whole retirement savings and the retirement program is based on the notion that by the time you get to retirement, you own a home outright, and therefore you can live on a pension. But if you don't, you're in the rental market, you're in deep trouble. And that's why the fastest growing cohort of homeless people in Australia is older women. It's not the biggest group, but it's the fastest growing cohort.
Have you got a map for that?
We can look at single pensioners, yes, so you can look at that. And there is data, if you go to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, you can have a look at all of the data from the homelessness sector or the ABS, if you go to the ABS and type in homelessness, you'll get the last census data from the ABS, which shows you the different cohorts. The biggest cohort is young people. The next biggest is older people, and one of the other biggest cohorts is women escaping domestic violence. I've always had a question in my mind whether that's a homelessness issue or whether it really needs to be taken out of the homelessness stuff and looked at in a different way altogether. But we can come back to that if you like. So what we have is the growing importance of renters. So renters are now 31% of all households. That is because home ownership is declining. Anglicare estimates that 1% of all rental dwellings on their census day are affordable and available to low-income households. That's an appalling statistic. So we've got home ownership in decline, as I pointed out before, but it's also in decline at every level except for that 65 and over age group. Renting in Australia was always designed as a short-term option, and our rental laws were designed for a short-term market. It was anticipated that, you know, when you're a student, you might go and live in the rental market, but once you got a job, you buy a home and you move out of it. So it was all short-term. Now the average length of renting is over 10 years, and for millennials and subsequent generations, they expect to be renting for life in many cases, unless they've got access to the bank of mum and dad. Or maybe, if they're lucky and they get a miracle, they might get the first home deposit scheme. Renting is expensive, insecure and poor quality. How do I know that? Because we partner with Choice and the National Association of Tenant Organisations to produce this report. The last one was called Disrupted, the first one was called Unsettled. But what it does is survey renters themselves to find out what their experience of renting is actually like. And this is what we find. 51% of people who rent are living in a home that is currently in need of repairs. 83% of people who rent express concern about the stress caused by the effort needed to move, and they have to move often. Nearly 1 in 10 think they will be forced to move in the next 12 months. And I can see a lot of nodding heads from renters in the room. And almost 7 in 10 who rent are concerned that a request for repairs could mean a rent rise. One of the most disturbing findings that we've found in these reports is that the longer you rent, the less likely you are to report an issue in terms of maintenance or repairs. What that says to me is that the experience of renters is that every time they've reported something, they've been punished for it. They've been evicted at the end of the lease, their rent's gone up, so on and so forth. So renting in Australia is really not a very pleasant experience for a lot of people. You just think about the cost of having to move every 12 months. You know, the average renter over a 10-year span will probably live in 4 to 6 different properties. Every time you move, there's a huge cost. Anybody who's moved knows that. And it's not just the cost of moving furniture, etc., but changing schools, losing your doctor, losing connection with your local community, all that social capital that we value so highly gets disrupted and lost when you have to move, which is why we call this report Disrupted. The quality of Australia's rental housing is also not very good, and this is really a map of what the quality looks like per jurisdiction in Australia. So all of this is about properties that need a repair. I'm just going to flash through this because I want to get through a couple of other things as well. We had a spotlight in this report about Australian women over 55 who rent. 66% have previously owned a residential home and no longer own it. That's a really key statistic. So it used to be that once you owned a home, that was a permanent solution for you. I really like that phrasing, but nonetheless, that was the case. You bought a home, you stayed there for life. Home ownership is now a much more fluid thing. It's a much more risky proposition than it used to be, and far too many people are falling out of it as well. 48% of these women are living alone, you know. This is, and yet our rental stock isn't really built for that. It's still mostly 3 and 4 bedrooms and whatnot. So your options become limited. Where you can be, what proximity to shops and facilities and health facilities, etc. that you need is really limited. And 66% of them reported that even a 10% increase in rent would mean that their budget became impossible. That's a real tragedy as well. So our solution really is that we need a national housing strategy. I've tried to run through a range of the problems, but now I want to turn to a few others, because there's a lot of elements involved in a national strategy, and it's the reason why you need a national strategy, because there are lots of different parts of the equation that need to be put together to make a rebalance of Australia's housing system. Firstly, tax reform. I talked about negative gearing and capital gains tax. Our emphasis will probably shift now from negative gearing, which will be seen to be political poison, to the need to reform capital gains tax, which is actually the more pernicious measure of those two things. If we can fix capital gains tax, you do two things. One, you get the revenue to pay for housing, and two, you stop the distortions that currently distort our housing market. It's not about driving investors away, but rebalancing the level of investment or finding different pathways for investors to invest. So, for example, why do you need to own a whole property to be a housing investor? Why couldn't we be investing in housing trusts which have the same tax treatment as individual investors? Less generous than what we have now, but the same tax treatment. So we're creating a store of capital that could then be applied to residential property and affordable housing with a government incentive to support the return on investment of that. And then you could invest 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, still be in housing, still be in the property industry without having to purchase a whole home. Currently, the system is out of balance, so people on lower incomes with lower savings can't get into it at all. And that's not fair in our view, and it also stops institutions from investing. So super funds don't get the same tax treatment as an individual investor, so why would they invest? They don't. The constant refrain we get from superannuation funds is the yield's too low, we don't get the rate of return, so why should we do it? Even though we know super funds in Australia invest in affordable housing in the US, in the UK, in Europe, all over the world they invest in this same stuff and they won't do it here. So tax reform can help that. Planning measures. We've heard some talk about inclusionary zoning before, and I would certainly encourage councils in New South Wales who now have the ability to apply inclusionary zoning to have a serious look at doing so. Especially on infill, especially for all sorts of purposes, but particularly for affordable housing and social housing. Inclusionary zoning is a way of future-proofing our housing systems against the erosions that we've seen over the last 20 years, and that's why it's incredibly important. If there's one planning measure, and there are many planning measures that can be applied, inclusionary zoning is the one that we know. And from our perspective, we mandate it. We'd have it as a mandatory requirement for any planning scheme that you have to have inclusionary zoning in it. It shouldn't necessarily be voluntary from our perspective. Now, I know there'd be arguments about that from council, etc., but maybe we can have those later. We need investment. Now, that's from both governments, but from the private sector. Our estimation of what it would cost to start addressing that backlog of housing is at least $150 billion over the next 10 years. There is no way known we're going to get $150 billion out of governments. It's just not going to happen in this day and age. They are just averse to doing that. So most of that money has to come from somewhere else. Where's it going to come from? The private sector is where it's going to come from. But the private sector won't do it because there's no return on investment. So therefore there has to be an incentive. The government's role, therefore, is to provide the incentive that meets the gap between the yield that those private sector investors make. Now that is what Labor's scheme was about. The National Rental Affordability Scheme that is starting to wind down now was about that. It was about meeting that yield gap that investors needed to invest in affordable housing. NRAS was a successful program. It was probably slightly too generous and it had all sorts of administrative issues that could have easily been addressed, but weren't. Instead it was ditched. But I've had private conversations with Scott Morrison, I don't mind saying this, where he's looked at me in the eye and said, I was actually a big supporter of NRAS when it first came out. And I looked at him and said, really? And he said, yes, I was. So what happened? He said, oh, all of the rorts and whatnot. And I said, no, don't talk to me about that. All of the administrative problems that NRAS did have could have been easily fixed. The issue of student housing that was raised by the Australian in such a spectacular way was 1,400 properties out of 35,000. It was a tiny issue, and it was really about attacking the scheme, telling fibs, not about accurate reporting and fixing it. And it could have been fixed. There was no student housing in Queensland, and it's particularly for foreign students. Why? Because they had a different way of allocating and assessing applicants for the scheme. I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to keep going. Tenancy law reform has to be done because of the reasons that I've just explained. Our tenancy laws are not adequate and not fit for purpose for this time. Governments have a role, as I've described, not just in funding but in setting the rules. The community sector has a big role as the growth engine for affordable housing in Australia. So, and there's a data issue. We don't have very good data on the housing system in Australia. Labor would have also reinstituted the National Housing Supply Council, which was the best data source we had. It was disbanded by the Abbott government and has never made a comeback. I'm hopeful that this government will see sense and reinstate our National Housing Supply Council so we can have that data returned to us. But this is the vision that we maintain. It is growing social and affordable housing using a variety of means, primarily through the community housing sector, but it also means having space for things like tiny homes, which you're about to hear about. It means having planning measures which support the system. It means having an affordable rental incentive. It means the Commonwealth coming to the party with capital grants. It means leveraging borrowing through the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which is the NIFIC that's up there. It means a growth of not-for-profit or NGO real estate agents, which are growing all of the time throughout Australia, and something that I'd encourage you to have a look at. The tax office is providing particular rulings for not-for-profit real estate agents, so that if you attract someone who wants to rent a house at sub-market rent, they can deduct the difference between market and sub-market rents as a tax deduction, but only if it's managed through a not-for-profit community housing provider. Community land trusts can be a great solution if they're structured properly. None of these things are necessarily going to do it by themselves at the scale that we need, but all together they add up to a national housing strategy. It's not a one-pronged thing, and it's why it needs federal government leadership. Not necessarily running the whole show, but leading and coordinating. So it's about villages and megacities. It's this tension between a unifying structure of a national housing strategy and what you do locally in Nambucca and Bellingen, you know. Solutions must have problems must have local solutions. I think I've put that the wrong way in that slide. Mechanisms and programs need flexibility, so they can't be rigid in terms of their application. A lot of the things that we do are invented in Canberra. A set formula is established and you must comply to the formula, even if it doesn't suit you in the particular area that you are. Now, we know that you have to have flexibility. It needs to connect with the lived experience of real people, not be a theoretical model that you have to shove things into. And it has to understand the different paths that people take. You know? And I'm really thinking about homelessness there and the different paths into and out of homelessness. We have to turn all the taps off that create homelessness in the first place, the institutions that drive homelessness from the very beginning, our prison systems which exit people into terrible solutions, our mental health facilities which often exit people into homelessness, so on and so forth. Those taps have to be turned off. It's got to be housing first, not people last. That's a bit of a slogan, but, you know, housing first is really about providing the housing, which is the solution, but then tailoring the particular needs that people have to the particular people, not one size fits all. There's never any getting around the need for a massive government subsidy of this. You know, subsidised housing requires a subsidy. It's a bit of a surprise to some people. It's a bit of a universal truth as well. If we provided half the subsidy to housing that we provide to the wealth generation of our landlord class at the moment, we could solve this problem in a very short time. And it's a layered solution. It's not about one thing. It's about layering those measures so that you put together a suite of tools which enable us to do it everywhere and anywhere, not just in Sydney or in one particular location. And I think that's it from me, so thanks for your attention.